Ladies and gentlemen, today we delve into a place that has become infamous worldwide, a fortress of punishment, a symbol of El Salvador's war on gangs, the CECOT mega prison. Officially known as the Terrorism Confinement Center, Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo, this facility has been labeled the harshest lockup on earth. Built by President Nayib Bukele's government, the prison is designed to house 40,000 of the most dangerous gang members, primarily from MS-13 and Barrio 18, the two most feared gangs in the country. This supermax facility, surrounded by towering concrete walls and guarded by thousands of heavily armed soldiers, is a statement to the world. El Salvador will not tolerate gang violence anymore. The conditions inside CECOT are brutal. Inmates are stripped of all freedoms. There are no windows, no contact with the outside world, and no chances of rehabilitation. Cells are cramped, and prisoners are forced to sleep on concrete floors. There is no privacy, no recreation, and no human rights activism allowed inside its walls. This is not just a prison. It is a living nightmare for those locked inside. The world has taken notice. Some praise Bukele's iron fist approach, claiming it has drastically reduced crime and given peace back to ordinary Salvadorans. Others condemn it as a human rights violation, arguing that mass arrests and indefinite detentions undermine justice. Regardless of perspective, one thing is certain. CECOT mega prison represents a turning point in the global fight against organized crime. But it also raises a crucial question. At what cost does security come? Are such extreme measures justified if they bring order, or do they set a dangerous precedent for authoritarian rule? Ladies and gentlemen, the answer may depend on whether you view El Salvador's gang crisis as a war or a challenge that demands a more balanced, humane solution. The world is watching, and the story of CECOT is far from over. CECOT mega prison is the largest and most extreme prison in the world, designed for 40,000 of El Salvador's most dangerous gang members. El Salvador's CECOT mega prison is unlike any other correctional facility on earth. Officially known as the Terrorism Confinement Center, Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo, it is the largest maximum security prison in Latin America, built with the sole purpose of housing the country's most violent and dangerous criminals. With a staggering capacity of 40,000 inmates, CECOT is a massive complex designed to detain the most feared gang members, primarily from the notorious MS-13 and Barrio 18 gangs. These two criminal organizations have long been responsible for much of the country's violence, including homicides, drug trafficking, kidnappings, and extortion. The prison, constructed in record time under the administration of President Nayib Bukele, is a key part of his government's state of emergency and crackdown on gang violence. Before CECOT, El Salvador was considered one of the world's most violent countries, with gang-related crime terrorizing everyday citizens. The Salvadoran government launched mass arrests, rounding up tens of thousands of suspected gang members, filling existing prisons beyond capacity. The construction of CECOT became a necessary step to contain this influx of prisoners while also isolating them from the rest of society. Spanning 165 hectares, over 400 acres, the prison is a fortress built for complete control and suppression. It is surrounded by 11-meter high concrete walls, topped with barbed wire and reinforced with watchtowers strategically placed to monitor every movement inside and outside the facility. The prison's infrastructure is designed for zero escape possibilities, featuring electronically controlled gates, high-tech surveillance cameras, and motion detection sensors that track all activity. It is heavily guarded by over 600 soldiers and 250 police officers, making it an impenetrable stronghold. Unlike traditional prisons that allow for some level of rehabilitation or inmate activities, CECOT is purely punitive. It does not offer outdoor recreation, educational programs, or work opportunities for prisoners. Instead, inmates are forced into absolute submission, with limited movement, minimal communication, and harsh living conditions. This approach aims to completely dismantle gang operations, as members are unable to coordinate criminal activities from inside the prison, a common issue in many Latin American jails. The opening of CECOT marked a historic shift in El Salvador's criminal justice system. While many supporters praise it as a necessary measure to restore peace and security, critics argue that it represents a move toward authoritarianism and human rights abuses. The facility is designed to remove gang influence from society, but it also raises ethical concerns about mass incarceration, legal due process, and inhumane conditions. The CECOT mega prison is more than just a prison. It is a symbol of a nation's extreme approach to fighting crime. Its effectiveness and long-term impact on El Salvador remain topics of intense debate worldwide. It was built under President Nayib Bukele's administration as part of his crackdown on gangs, particularly MS-13 and Barrio 18. The CECOT mega prison is a direct result of President Nayib Bukele's aggressive stance on crime and gang violence, which has long plagued El Salvador. Before Bukele took office in 2019, the country had one of the highest homicide rates in the world, largely due to the presence of two dominant gangs, MS-13, Mara Salvatrucha, and Barrio 18. These gangs controlled neighborhoods, extorted businesses, and committed brutal acts of violence against civilians, police officers, and rival gang members. For decades, previous governments struggled to control the situation, often oscillating between negotiating with gang leaders and using force. However, neither approach yielded lasting results. The gangs continued to expand their influence, even running their operations from within prisons. It was in this context that Nayib Bukele, a young and tech-savvy leader, came to power with a promise to eradicate gang violence once and for all. His administration launched an unprecedented crackdown, implementing a state of emergency that gave law enforcement extraordinary powers to arrest suspected gang members without warrants. This sweeping anti-gang operation, known as the War on Gangs, led to the mass arrest of over 70,000 individuals in just a couple of years. As the country's existing prisons became dangerously overcrowded, Bukele's government fast-tracked the construction of CECOT, a supermax prison designed to hold the nation's most dangerous criminals. The project was announced in 2022, and within months, the high-security facility was completed, an extraordinary feat in terms of both speed and scale. Bukele has marketed CECOT as the ultimate solution to El Salvador's gang crisis. His administration claims that by removing tens of thousands of suspected gang members from the streets and placing them in a hyper-controlled, isolated environment, the country's crime rates would drop significantly. And indeed, the results have been dramatic. Homicides, extortion cases, and gang-related activities have plummeted. Many Salvadorans, especially those who have lived under the terror of gangs for years, support Bukele's hardline approach, viewing CECOT as a necessary evil to restore peace and security. However, Bukele's tough-on-crime policies have not been without controversy. Human rights organizations and international watchdogs, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have raised serious concerns about the mass incarceration strategy. Reports suggest that many innocent people, including young men with no criminal history, have been caught up in the wave of arrests, detained without due process or trial. Critics argue that Bukele's policies prioritize military-style policing over judicial fairness, potentially setting a dangerous precedent for future authoritarian governance. Another significant criticism is the lack of transparency regarding who is being arrested and how long they will be held. Under the state of emergency, many detainees have been denied access to legal representation or even basic contact with their families. The Salvadoran government's stance has been unapologetic. Bukele insists that anyone detained will remain behind bars unless proven otherwise, reversing the standard legal principle of innocent until proven guilty. Despite these concerns, Bukele's anti-gang campaign has made him one of the most popular leaders in Latin America. His approval ratings remain extraordinarily high, as many Salvadorans feel that, for the first time in decades, they can walk the streets without fear of gang violence. CECOT, in many ways, stands as a symbol of his power, efficiency, and no-nonsense approach to governance. Whether it will serve as a long-term solution or simply a temporary suppression of gang activity remains a major question. The future of El Salvador's criminal justice system and its democracy will largely depend on how Bukele and his administration manage the consequences of such an extreme approach. Security in and around the prison is extreme, with high walls, 24/7 surveillance, and thousands of armed guards. The CECOT mega prison is designed to be an impenetrable fortress, ensuring that the 40,000 gang members held inside remain completely cut off from the outside world. Given El Salvador's long history of gang influence within prisons, where inmates have continued to run criminal operations even while incarcerated, the government took extraordinary security measures to prevent any form of communication, escape, or external interference. From the moment a prisoner enters CECOT, they are stripped of any autonomy. The facility is surrounded by towering 11-meter-high, 36-foot, concrete walls, reinforced with electrified barbed wire, making any escape attempt virtually impossible. The prison itself is spread over 165 hectares, 400 acres, creating a vast, isolated compound that is heavily patrolled. The prison surveillance system is one of the most advanced in the world. Thousands of high-resolution security cameras cover every inch of the facility, monitoring both the prison cells and common areas 24/7. These cameras are equipped with facial recognition technology and motion detection sensors, ensuring that every movement inside the prison is tracked. Even the guards are under constant surveillance, preventing any possibility of corruption or unauthorized interactions with prisoners. CECOT is protected by a multi-layered security force. More than 600 soldiers and 250 police officers are permanently stationed at the facility, equipped with automatic weapons, riot gear, and armored vehicles. The prison is also located in a remote area, further reducing the risk of external interference or escape attempts. Unlike many traditional prisons, where smuggled phones or bribe guard allow inmates to communicate with the outside world, CECOT is designed to eliminate all outside contact. There are no public phone lines, no visitations from family members, and no legal calls, ensuring that imprisoned gang leaders cannot continue directing criminal activities. Each section of the prison is highly restricted, with separate areas for different categories of inmates. Prisoners are assigned to cells based on their gang affiliation to prevent riots between MS-13 and Barrio 18 members. However, this is not a luxury. It is a control tactic, allowing authorities to monitor gang interactions and prevent internal conflict from spreading beyond prison walls. Prisoners are constantly moved in a dehumanizing manner, forced to run handcuffed, barefoot, and bent over, surrounded by heavily armed guards. This strict control over movement ensures that inmates remain completely subdued and unable to challenge prison authorities. Even inside the cells, security remains tight. Each cramped cell houses dozens of inmates, with no beds, no mattresses, and limited access to water and sanitation. The doors are made of solid iron with small observation slots, allowing guards to monitor prisoners at all times. There are no windows, making the environment permanently dark and airless, further breaking the spirits of the inmates. The CECOT mega prison is designed not just to imprison, but to completely incapacitate and dehumanize the criminals inside. Its extreme security measures send a clear message to both prisoners and the outside world. There is no escape, no second chances, and no return to power for the gang members locked within its walls. Prison conditions are extremely harsh, with overcrowded cells, no windows, no rehabilitation programs, and complete isolation from the outside world. The CECOT mega prison is designed to be one of the most brutal and restrictive incarceration facilities in the world. Unlike traditional prisons, where inmates may have access to education, rehabilitation programs, and limited freedoms, CECOT is purely a place of punishment and containment. The prison operates under the philosophy that its inmates, mostly members of MS-13 and Barrio 18, are too dangerous to be rehabilitated and must be completely isolated from society. Inside CECOT, living conditions are designed to break prisoners psychologically and physically. The cells are overcrowded, with no beds, mattresses, or proper sleeping arrangements. Instead, inmates are forced to sleep on the hard concrete floors, often crammed together in small spaces with no room to move freely. Each tiny cell houses several dozen prisoners, making basic hygiene and sanitation nearly impossible. With no running water available in the cells, prisoners rely on strict rations provided by guards, further emphasizing the prison's harsh control over their survival. There are no windows, meaning prisoners spend 24 hours a day in darkness, with only artificial lighting controlled by prison authorities. This lack of natural light can cause serious mental and physical health issues, including depression, disorientation, and vitamin deficiencies. Inmates have no sense of time, which adds to their psychological torment. The air inside the cells is stale and suffocating, creating an oppressive and claustrophobic environment. Rehabilitation programs do not exist in CECOT. There are no educational courses, no vocational training, and no psychological counseling. A stark contrast to many modern prisons that aim to reform inmates and prepare them for reintegration into society. Instead, prisoners are kept in a constant state of submission, with their only daily routine being forced movements under strict surveillance. There are no outdoor exercise yards, meaning inmates do not get fresh air or sunlight. They remain locked inside their cells for nearly the entire day, only leaving when forced to move in mass formations, hunched over, hands bound behind their backs, and surrounded by armed guards. Food and medical care are extremely limited. Prisoners receive only 2 meals per day, usually consisting of basic rations of rice, beans, and tortillas with little nutritional value. Medical attention is scarce, and injured or sick inmates often go untreated, reinforcing the idea that CECOT is not a place for rehabilitation but pure punishment. The prison also enforces total isolation from the outside world. Unlike most correctional facilities where inmates can receive visits from family members, lawyers, or even human rights organizations, CECOT forbids all outside contact. There are no phone calls, no letters, and no visitations, making it impossible for inmates to communicate with anyone beyond the prison walls. This measure is intended to cut off gang leaders from their criminal networks, preventing them from continuing to operate from behind bars, as they had done in previous prisons. Discipline inside the prison is harsh and unforgiving. Any sign of disobedience, defiance, or even minor infractions results in severe punishment, which can include beatings, prolonged isolation, or further restrictions on food and water. Prison guards operate with absolute authority, ensuring that no prisoner challenges the system. The lack of oversight from external human rights organizations means that mistreatment and abuse often go undocumented. CECOT is not just a prison. It is a modern-day dungeon, a facility designed to instill fear and exert complete control over its inmates. The harsh conditions ensure that prisoners lose all sense of dignity, freedom, and hope, reinforcing the Salvadoran government's message. Once you enter CECOT, you are forgotten by the world. The facility is criticized for potential human rights violations, including inhumane treatment, lack of legal due process, and indefinite detention. Since its opening, CECOT Mega Prison has been the subject of intense international criticism, with human rights organizations, legal experts, and activists raising serious concerns about the treatment of inmates and the broader legal implications of its operation. While the Salvadoran government presents CECOT as a necessary tool in the war against gangs, opponents argue that the facility violates fundamental human rights and represents a dangerous shift toward authoritarianism. One of the primary concerns is the inhumane treatment of prisoners. Reports indicate that detainees inside CECOT are subjected to harsh and degrading conditions. With overcrowded cells, no access to natural light, minimal food, and no sanitation, prisoners are deprived of basic human needs. Inmates are also denied medical attention, meaning those suffering from injuries, chronic illnesses, or infections often go untreated. The lack of health care has raised fears that diseases could spread rapidly within the facility, leading to unreported deaths. Critics also argue that CECOT strips prisoners of all human dignity. From the moment they enter, they are shaved bald, forced to strip naked, and paraded through the prison in a submissive posture, surrounded by heavily armed guards. These methods, meant to establish total dominance, are seen by many as psychological torture rather than legitimate security measures. Unlike conventional prisons, where inmates may engage in rehabilitation, education, or work programs, CECOT offers no opportunity for personal growth or redemption. The prisoners are essentially left to rot in their cells, with no access to books, writing materials, or even basic forms of mental stimulation. This extreme isolation can lead to severe psychological distress, including depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. Another major issue is the lack of legal due process for many of the inmates. Under President Nayib Bukele's state of emergency, Salvadoran authorities have been granted sweeping powers to arrest and detain suspected gang members without warrants. This means that thousands of individuals have been imprisoned without formal charges, trials, or opportunities to defend themselves in court. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have documented cases where innocent people were swept up in mass arrests simply for having tattoos, living in gang-controlled neighborhoods, or being young men of a certain demographic. Families of detainees often have no information on their loved ones' whereabouts and no legal recourse to challenge their detention. The Salvadoran government's response to these accusations has been defiant. Bukele and his administration insist that tough measures are necessary to eradicate gang violence, and that those arrested are dangerous criminals who deserve no sympathy. The government has repeatedly ignored calls from international courts and human rights bodies to improve prison conditions or provide fair trials. Instead, officials have argued that El Salvador's dramatic reduction in crime rates is proof that their strategy is working, regardless of external criticism. Perhaps the most alarming aspect of CECOT is the concept of indefinite detention. Many of the prisoners inside the facility have no set release date and no clear legal process to determine their fate. Under the emergency laws, individuals can be held indefinitely without a trial, a practice that violates international human rights standards. The risk of abuse of power is high, as the government has near total control over who is detained and for how long. This raises the question of whether CECOT is truly a prison for criminals or a political tool used to consolidate state power by suppressing opposition and instilling fear in the population. Despite these concerns, public support for CECOT remains high within El Salvador, as many citizens feel that the extreme measures are a necessary evil to restore peace. However, legal experts warn that the erosion of judicial rights and the normalization of mass incarceration without trials could have long-term consequences, potentially turning El Salvador into a police state where individual freedoms are sacrificed in the name of security. Despite criticism, many Salvadorans support the prison, seeing it as a necessary measure to combat the country's long history of gang violence. While human rights organizations and international watchdogs criticize CECOT mega prison, a significant portion of El Salvador's population strongly supports it. To many Salvadorans, especially those who have lived under the brutal rule of MS-13 and Barrio 18, the prison is not just a facility. It is a symbol of justice, revenge, and long-awaited security. For decades, these gangs controlled entire neighborhoods, extorting businesses, recruiting children into crime, and murdering thousands with impunity. The Salvadoran people endured years of terror, where stepping outside after dark, refusing to pay extortion fees, or even living in the wrong neighborhood could mean a death sentence. Under previous governments, many Salvadorans felt abandoned. Authorities were either too weak, too corrupt, or too afraid to take decisive action against the gangs. Criminal organizations operated openly, running their enterprises even from inside prison walls. Gang leaders could bribe prison guards, order assassinations from their cells, and maintain contact with the outside world. Even when gang members were arrested, many were soon released due to lack of evidence, weak judicial systems, or deals made between gangs and politicians. As a result, trust in the government's ability to fight crime was at an all-time low before President Nayib Bukele took office. Bukele's war on gangs changed everything. Under his administration, law enforcement launched mass arrests, rounding up tens of thousands of suspected gang members and removing them from the streets overnight. The government then fast-tracked the construction of CECOT, a facility that promised to permanently imprison the most violent criminals, eliminating their influence once and for all. As crime rates plummeted, many citizens, especially those in gang-controlled neighborhoods, felt a newfound sense of safety for the first time in decades. For many Salvadorans, CECOT is proof that Bukele is keeping his promises. They see the prison as a necessary evil, arguing that the harsh conditions are justified given the horrors the gangs inflicted on innocent people. Some survivors of gang violence even celebrate the suffering of the inmates, believing that those inside CECOT are finally receiving the punishment they deserve. To them, the concerns raised by human rights groups seem irrelevant compared to the decades of pain, fear, and loss inflicted by MS-13 and Barrio 18. Beyond the emotional relief, CECOT and Bukele's policies have produced measurable results. El Salvador, once one of the most dangerous countries in the world, has seen a dramatic decline in homicides, extortion cases, and violent crimes. Businesses that once paid protection money to gangs now operate without fear of retribution. Families that previously avoided certain neighborhoods can now walk freely, and children are no longer forcibly recruited into criminal organizations. The transformation has been so dramatic that Bukele's approval ratings remain among the highest of any world leader, with support hovering above 85% in most polls. However, this widespread support also raises important questions. Some critics warn that Salvadorans, desperate for security, may be overlooking the risks of mass incarceration and authoritarian tactics. While CECOT is currently filled with gang members, many legal experts worry that in the future, the same policies could be used to imprison political opponents, journalists, or activists who criticize the government. Others argue that not every person arrested was actually a gang member, and some innocent people may now be suffering inside CECOT without a fair trial or legal representation. Yet, for many ordinary citizens, these concerns take a back seat to the immediate reality. Life in El Salvador is safer than it has been in years. And as long as crime rates remain low, public support for Bukele, CECOT, and the harsh crackdown on gangs is unlikely to fade. The prison plays a key role in President Bukele's larger strategy to eliminate gangs and position himself as a strong, no-nonsense leader. The CECOT mega prison is not just a detention facility. It is the centerpiece of President Nayib Bukele's broader political strategy. Since taking office in 2019, Bukele has pursued an aggressive campaign to eradicate gang violence, presenting himself as the only leader capable of restoring peace and security in El Salvador. His approach is not just about arresting criminals. It's about completely dismantling the power structures of MS-13 and Barrio 18, and in doing so, reshaping El Salvador's national identity. For decades, gang violence crippled El Salvador, making it one of the most dangerous countries in the world. These criminal organizations controlled entire neighborhoods, businesses, and even sections of the government, operating with near impunity. They enforced their own laws, taxed local businesses through extortion, and carried out assassinations against those who refused to comply. Many Salvadorans felt that they were living under a parallel government, one run by gang leaders instead of elected officials. Bukele saw this crisis not only as a security issue, but also as an opportunity to solidify his political power. By waging an all-out war on gangs, he positioned himself as a fearless, decisive leader, one who would do what no other president had been willing or able to do. His administration declared a state of emergency, allowing security forces to carry out mass arrests without the need for warrants or legal proceedings. More than 70,000 people were detained in a matter of months, including suspected gang members, affiliates, and even individuals who simply fit the profile of a gangster. With existing prisons overcrowded and ineffective, Bukele announced the construction of CECOT, a supermax facility designed to permanently house 40,000 of the country's most dangerous criminals. He publicly showcased the prison as a symbol of his strength and success, using it to reinforce his image as a no-nonsense, results-driven leader. Government-controlled media outlets and official social media accounts regularly share dramatic footage of heavily armed guards, long lines of tattooed inmates being herded into the prison, and images of gang members locked away in cramped, dark cells. Bukele's media-savvy approach has made CECOT more than just a prison. It is a political tool and a propaganda machine. Every time a new batch of prisoners is transferred to the facility, Bukele broadcasts it live on national television and social media, using the footage to instill fear in criminals and reassure citizens that the government is in control. These public displays have helped him cultivate a strongman image, one that resonates deeply with many Salvadorans who have suffered under gang rule for decades. His approach has proven wildly popular. Bukele's approval ratings consistently rank among the highest of any world leader, largely because Salvadorans have seen tangible improvements in their daily lives. Murder rates have dropped, extortion cases have decreased, and once dangerous neighborhoods are now safer than they have been in decades. People who once lived in constant fear of gang violence now feel secure walking the streets at night, a dramatic shift from the past. However, Bukele's hardline tactics and reliance on mass incarceration have also raised serious concerns among legal experts and human rights organizations. Critics argue that his use of emergency powers, suspension of constitutional rights, and suppression of judicial oversight could set a dangerous precedent. They warn that CECOT and the broader anti-gang crackdown could evolve into tools of political repression, used not just against criminals, but also against journalists, activists, and political opponents who dare to challenge Bukele's authority. Nonetheless, Bukele's strategy remains firmly in place, and CECOT is at the heart of it. Whether the prison will serve as a long-term solution to gang violence or simply as a temporary show of force remains to be seen. But for now, CECOT continues to be one of Bukele's most powerful symbols, a concrete, heavily guarded testament to his war on crime and his unyielding grip on power. The prison's existence raises questions about the long-term sustainability of El Salvador's anti-gang policies and what will happen to the next generation. While CECOT Mega Prison is seen as a powerful tool in El Salvador's war on gangs, it also raises serious concerns about the long-term consequences of President Nayib Bukele's anti-gang policies. The mass incarceration strategy, which has led to the arrest of over 70,000 people, has undeniably reduced crime rates. But what happens next? Is this crackdown a permanent solution, or will it eventually lead to a new cycle of violence, instability, or even state repression? A key issue is the sustainability of mass incarceration. CECOT was built to house 40,000 prisoners, yet El Salvador has detained nearly twice that number under the current state of emergency. Even with this massive prison, the government may run out of space if arrests continue at this rate. There is also the financial burden. Operating a high-security facility of this scale is extremely costly. Maintaining thousands of guards, security systems, and daily provisions for inmates will require a long-term budget commitment, which could put pressure on El Salvador's already fragile economy. If economic instability worsens, will the government continue to prioritize CECOT, or will it face challenges maintaining its strict prison policies? Beyond the prison walls, a larger concern is what happens to the next generation of Salvadorans. Historically, gang membership in El Salvador has often been fueled by poverty, lack of education, and social exclusion. Many young men joined gangs because they had no opportunities for legal employment, faced discrimination, or grew up in violent communities where gang life was the only path to survival. Bukele's government has focused on punishment rather than prevention, meaning that while today's gang members may be locked up, the conditions that created them still exist. Without investment in education, job opportunities, and social programs, there's a risk that new gangs could emerge in the coming years. Young people, particularly those from poor backgrounds, may still be vulnerable to criminal recruitment, organized crime, or even new extremist groups. Some experts argue that arresting tens of thousands of gang members without addressing the root causes of violence is like cutting off the branches of a tree but leaving the roots intact. Eventually, crime could grow back in a different form. Another major concern is how the government will handle those who were wrongly imprisoned. Reports from human rights organizations suggest that thousands of innocent people, including minors, workers, and students, were swept up in the mass arrests. With the legal system heavily tilted in favor of the government, these individuals may have no way to prove their innocence. If wrongful detentions continue, there is a risk of creating widespread resentment, particularly among the families of those imprisoned. This could eventually lead to political instability, social unrest, or even acts of retaliation against the government. There is also the question of reintegration. While Bukele's policies aim to permanently imprison gang members, the reality is that not every person arrested will serve a life sentence. Some inmates may eventually be released, either due to lack of evidence, completed sentences, or political shifts. The question then becomes, what happens when thousands of former prisoners return to society? If they leave CECOT with no skills, no rehabilitation, and no hope for legal employment, there is a real risk that they may return to criminal activity, potentially making the gang problem resurface in a different way. Internationally, El Salvador's strategy has also raised concerns about the erosion of democracy and human rights. Other countries facing gang violence, such as Honduras and Guatemala, are watching closely to see if Bukele's policies work in the long run. If they do, other nations may replicate his harsh measures. But if they fail, El Salvador could become a warning example of how mass incarceration leads to deeper political and social problems. Ultimately, the long-term success of CECOT and El Salvador's anti-gang policies will depend on whether the government follows up with meaningful social reforms. Without efforts to create jobs, improve education, and provide alternatives to crime, there is a risk that future generations will face the same cycle of violence that led to the rise of gangs in the first place. Critics argue that while CECOT may suppress gang activity in the short term, it does not address the root causes of crime, such as poverty, unemployment, and social inequality. The CECOT mega prison has been hailed by the Salvadoran government as a historic achievement in the fight against gangs. But critics argue that it fails to address the deeper societal problems that have fueled gang violence in the first place. While mass incarceration may temporarily remove criminals from the streets, it does not eliminate the conditions that led to the rise of gangs, poverty, lack of education, unemployment, and social marginalization. Without addressing these issues, some experts warn that El Salvador may be caught in a never-ending cycle of violence and repression. For decades, gang culture in El Salvador has thrived in economically disadvantaged communities. Many young men, often from broken homes and with few job opportunities, have seen gang membership as a way to escape poverty and gain protection. In neighborhoods where government presence was weak, gangs provided a form of social structure, offering young recruits a sense of belonging, financial support, and even status. The failure of past governments to provide jobs, education, and social services meant that, for many, joining a gang seemed like the only viable path to survival. Bukele's government has taken an aggressive, punitive approach to gang violence, rounding up tens of thousands of suspected gang members and locking them away in CECOT. However, this heavy-handed strategy ignores the deeper reasons why gangs exist in the first place. Critics argue that without meaningful economic and social reforms, new generations of disenfranchised youth may still turn to crime, creating the next wave of gang-related problems. One of the biggest concerns is employment. Many of those arrested and sent to CECOT come from impoverished backgrounds where legal job opportunities were scarce. Even if some of these individuals are eventually released, what future will they have? In El Salvador, being labeled a former prisoner or having gang tattoos often makes it impossible to find work, as employers refuse to hire people with criminal records. Without access to jobs or vocational training, many former inmates may have no choice but to return to illegal activities. Another issue is education. For years, gangs have recruited young men directly from schools, using intimidation tactics to force students into joining their ranks. Many students drop out of school out of fear, limiting their opportunities for a better future. Yet, CECOT and the government security policies focus entirely on punishment, with little investment in keeping young people out of gangs in the first place. If El Salvador does not provide stronger education systems, scholarships, and mentorship programs, the next generation may face the same pressures to join criminal organizations, even if today's gang leaders are locked away. Additionally, mass incarceration can have unintended social consequences. Many prisoners inside CECOT have families, including children, spouses, and elderly parents who relied on them for financial support. When a young man is arrested and thrown into CECOT, his family is left without income, often pushing them further into poverty and desperation. In some cases, this can lead to more crime, as families struggle to survive and turn to illegal activities for income. Critics argue that arresting tens of thousands of people without providing alternative economic solutions can create a ripple effect, where the next generation of Salvadorans grows up even more vulnerable to crime and violence. International human rights organizations have also pointed out that focusing entirely on mass imprisonment ignores the need for social rehabilitation. Many countries that have successfully reduced gang violence, such as Colombia and Italy, have done so through a combination of law enforcement and social programs. Instead of relying solely on prisons, they have invested in reintegration programs, job training, and education to help former criminals reintegrate into society. El Salvador, on the other hand, has focused almost entirely on punishment, with little to no efforts aimed at rehabilitation. Some critics fear that CECOT is merely a temporary solution, one that creates the illusion of safety while failing to resolve the deep-rooted social issues that led to gang violence in the first place. If the government does not address economic disparity, education gaps, and job shortages, El Salvador may find itself in the same crisis again in the future, with a new generation of criminals replacing the old ones. Ultimately, the success of CECOT and Bukele's anti-gang policies will not be measured by how many people are imprisoned, but by whether El Salvador can break free from the cycle of crime and poverty that has plagued it for decades. The international community remains divided on CECOT, with some praising its effectiveness in reducing crime, while others condemn it for human rights violations. The CECOT mega prison has sparked intense debate on the global stage, with governments, human rights organizations, and international bodies divided over whether it represents a bold step toward security or a serious threat to democracy and human rights. On one hand, CECOT and President Nayib Bukele's mass incarceration policies have been credited with dramatically reducing crime rates in El Salvador, transforming the country from one of the world's most dangerous places to one of its safest. On the other hand, many critics warn that these methods rely on authoritarian tactics, the erosion of due process, and widespread human rights abuses, raising concerns about El Salvador's democratic future and whether this model should be replicated elsewhere. Supporters, a model for crime reduction? Some leaders and analysts see CECOT as a successful experiment in tackling organized crime. In Latin America, where gang violence has plagued many countries for decades, Bukele's iron-fisted approach has caught the attention of both politicians and ordinary citizens. Countries like Honduras and Ecuador, facing their own gang crises, have already begun adopting similar security measures, inspired by Bukele's success in reducing violence. For many, the numbers speak for themselves. Since the launch of Bukele's anti-gang crackdown, El Salvador's homicide rate has plummeted. Streets that were once controlled by gangs are now safer. Businesses can operate without extortion, and families no longer live in fear of random violence. Supporters argue that while CECOT's harsh conditions may seem extreme, they're justified given the brutality of MS-13, Barrio 18, and other criminal organizations that once terrorized the country. Some even suggest that the international community is being hypocritical in its criticism. They argue that Western nations, including the U.S., have their own maximum security prisons where dangerous criminals are held under similarly strict conditions. If the United States, Europe, and other developed nations can justify their own harsh prisons, Why should El Salvador be judged differently for taking decisive action against criminal organizations that have killed thousands of innocent people? For some leaders, particularly in other parts of Latin America and Africa, CECOT represents a possible solution to their own security challenges. Countries that struggle with high crime rates, weak law enforcement, and overcrowded prisons are looking at El Salvador as a case study, a potential model for dealing with deeply entrenched gang networks that traditional justice systems have failed to dismantle. Critics, a human rights crisis in the making. However, human rights organizations, legal experts, and international institutions paint a very different picture. Groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations have condemned El Salvador's security policies, arguing that CECOT is part of a larger authoritarian shift that prioritizes punishment over justice. These critics argue that while crime reduction is important, it cannot come at the expense of democracy, legal rights, and basic human dignity. One of the biggest concerns is the lack of due process. Under Bukele's state of emergency, the government has suspended key constitutional protections, allowing for mass arrests without warrants, prolonged detentions without trials, and limited access to legal representation. Reports suggest that thousands of innocent people, including minors, laborers, and bystanders, have been swept up in the crackdown simply because they lived in gang-controlled areas or had tattoos. Families of the incarcerated have protested, claiming that their loved ones were taken without evidence and have no way to defend themselves. Another major concern is the inhumane conditions inside CECOT. Video footage released by the government itself shows thousands of shirtless, heavily tattooed prisoners crammed into overcrowded cells, forced to sit motionless in tight rows for hours at a time. Human rights advocates argue that this treatment violates international standards for prisoner rights, warning that torture, malnutrition, and even extrajudicial killings could occur behind closed doors. There are also fears that CECOT could become a political weapon. While the prison is currently used to hold gang members, critics warn that Bukele's administration may eventually use it to silence journalists, political opponents, and activists who challenge his authority. As Bukele consolidates power, some analysts worry that his government is moving toward an authoritarian model, where prisons like CECOT become tools of state repression rather than crime control. The global debate: security versus human rights. The CECOT controversy reflects a broader global debate about how to handle crime and security threats. Some argue that in countries plagued by high levels of violence, extreme measures are necessary to restore order and allow economic growth. Others caution that eroding legal rights in the name of security can lead to a dangerous precedent, where governments justify dictatorial powers under the guise of public safety. The international response remains divided. While some leaders praise Bukele's success and see CECOT as a model for crime control, human rights organizations and democratic institutions warn that this level of repression comes with long-term risks. Will CECOT be remembered as a bold solution that eradicated gang violence? Or will it become a cautionary tale of a government that sacrificed democracy in pursuit of security? A dividing legacy. The CECOT mega prison stands as a symbol of both triumph and controversy, embodying El Salvador's drastic shift in its fight against crime. For President Nayib Bukele and his supporters, it is a testament to decisive leadership, a no-nonsense approach to security, and a turning point in the country's struggle against gang violence. To them, the sharp decline in murders, extortion, and gang activity is proof that harsh measures were necessary to restore peace and stability. However, for critics, CECOT represents a dangerous step toward authoritarian rule, where the erosion of due process, mass incarceration, and human rights violations threaten El Salvador's democracy and long-term stability. They warn that while prisons can hold criminals, they cannot eliminate the conditions that create them. And without investment in social reform, education, and economic opportunities, the country risks falling back into violence in the future. Whether CECOT will be remembered as a success story or a cautionary tale remains to be seen. Its impact on El Salvador and the world will depend on what happens next. Will the government balance security with justice? Or will the nation become trapped in an endless cycle of repression and unrest? The world is watching, and only time will reveal the true consequences of this unprecedented approach to crime control.